Um, so for the rest of this brain part one, we're going to be going over um, some of, again, the structural characteristics that we find for the cerebrum, and then the basic functions that are associated with them. And as I said at the end of our last class, when we're going through and we're learning about these parts of the brain and the functions associated with them, just always keep in mind, and I know it can be a tad bit frustrating, but there, with very few exceptions, is there a particular brain area that is associated with one and only one function? Because the boundaries are so indistinct, and because when we say communication, that communication implies that what we're talking about are synapses, right? That's the way in which neurons communicate with one another. And so synaptic activity is so um, complicated, and and can vary between person to person, largely, that it becomes, as we learn more about the brain, it becomes increasingly difficult to assign a specific function with just one area. And this will be kind of is highlighted when we get to memory, and we talk about memories, which have historically always been associated with the hippocampus, right? um, and don't get me wrong, the hippocampus plays a very important role in memories and in the formation of memories. However, what we know now is that storage of long-term memories um, largely takes place um, in the frontal cortex. So anyway, more on that to come, but it's just to say that there are oftentimes many different functions associated with a particular region of the brain. So, the brain itself, we organize up into 5 lobes. The lobes are named by the bony tissue that they overlie. So, in the front, we have what's called the frontal lobe. You can see that right here. As part of the frontal lobe, we have some important landmarks. So, we have what's called the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus, you can see here, is colored in blue. And in a moment, we're going to be looking at what we call a homunculus, which is a distorted map that gives you an idea of how many neurons are devoted to, in this case, because this is a motor, the precentral gyrus is it's a motor, controls motor function. It's also called, well, the precentral gyrus I should say, is within what we call the primary motor cortex. So the homunculus is going to be a map that shows you essentially how many neurons are devoted, or how much synaptic activity is devoted to a particular region of the body when it comes to controlling that region of the body. So that's the precentral gyrus. And then this, of course, is all the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe itself, from a functional standpoint, you can think of as being in charge of critical thinking, um, the reasoning and critical thinking, I already said, but reasoning and critical thinking abilities, personality. Um, it is the part of the brain that works along with the amygdala and other parts of the limbic system, to help with impulse control. So, and again, that kind of ties into this idea of critical thinking. Um, so decision making, all of that takes place in the frontal lobe. Um, there's some other important landmarks when it comes to the frontal lobe, aside from the precentral gyrus. So we have what we call the frontal eye field, right? So this, I guess, this whole area that's colored in red here is what we call the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex acts as an association area. We'll get into association areas here in a moment. But that's where this region is found. It's found just immediately anterior to the precentral gyrus. And then what you'll see in here is, as part of that, we have the frontal eye field. So this is this portion of brainy tissue that is devoted to controlling eye movement, voluntary eye movement. And then another interesting thing that we find on the left side of the frontal lobe is what we call Broca's area. So Broca's area, they're kind of in this image, kind of picking up Broca's area so you can see the insula. But Broca's area is involved with speech. It's involved with the portions, the ability for you to form the words that would be responsible for producing speech. And then, and I already talked about the precentral gyrus. So then underneath, as you can see, if you pick up this portion of the frontal lobe, there is a lobe that we call the insula. So the insula is an interesting lobe in that it is deep. It's one of the only structures that's deep, obviously, to the other lobes, which are found superficially. The insula is, we know, largely involved in our ability to taste. Um, it is also, there are parts of um, equilibrium that are also nestled right in with, and therefore arguably a part of the insula. So when the insula is damaged via, motor vehicle accident or what have you, um, individuals will report again an inability to taste and also oftentimes suffer from problems with equilibriums. Not vertigo necessarily, but kind of the inability to navigate space because they lose the ability to kind of tell where they are in space, especially with their eyes closed. Okay. And then we have over here the temporal lobes. So the temporal lobes, again, all of these lobes for the most part, aside from the insula, are going to overlie the bony tissue for which they're named. And so the temporal lobes, what you find in the temporal lobes are the auditory and the olfactory cortices. So what this tells you is that hearing and smell are controlled. Hearing and smell, and by controlled, I mean these parts of the brain contain the sensory neurons that are going to synapse, that are going to bring that information from the olfactory epithelial tissue, for example, or from the cells within the ear that pick up on those vibrations, and it's going to bring that information into the temporal lobe for processing. And again, with all these lobes, you're going to find these functions associated with the lobes, and then you're also going to find what we call association areas. And association areas are areas where the information that was brought in is taken there, and then it is integrated with other information. For example, past experiences of a similar sound or of a similar smell, to in order and then you have synapses there that allow you to essentially make sense, give context, if you will, to what it is, if we're talking about the temporal lobe, that you are smelling and you are hearing. All right. And then right above the temporal lobes, we have the parietal lobes. So the parietal lobes, where you can think of the frontal lobe as being in charge, in addition to, as we were discussing, critical thinking and decision making and personality and all of those functions. The frontal lobe contains the tissue that is responsible for motor movement. So voluntary, for example, voluntary motor movement is dictated by neurons that arise from this area right in here in the prefrontal, in the precentral gyrus. And then in the parietal lobes, if you're thinking of it, the frontal lobe as being kind of motor, the part of the brain that's responsible for motor movement. The parietal lobe is the lobe of the brain that's responsible for bringing in senses from the body, right? The somatosensory area. So this is going to be information that's coming from muscles in the body. That's going to be that information is taken for processing to what we call the postcentral gyrus, and the postcentral gyrus lies immediately posterior to the precentral gyrus and is separated from it by the central sulcus, which you can see here. Um, and then directly behind that, we have what we call the somatosensory association area. So this is going to be an area that, again, takes all of the information that's coming in from um, the body, the muscles of the body, along with other sensory information coming in from other tactile information, for example, that's coming in from receptors in the epidermis, et cetera, et cetera. And it's taking all of that information and it's integrating it with the information that is being brought in from all of the muscles and glands of our body, and it's integrating it so that our brains can kind of make sense of it. Another important area to note right here is what we call Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area is also found on the left side of the brain, and it is a part of the brain that is responsible for making sense of speech, right? So Wernicke's and Broca's work together to allow you to speak and to think in words, and to be able to express yourself linguistically. Um, when Wernicke's area is damaged, people can still form words. They haven't lost the ability as they would if they damaged Broca's to form the words, but oftentimes the words that they're saying are no longer associated with meaning. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this class. Let me make sure I've just not left anything out. I think that's all I want to say on this side. Okay, so here are those homunculi that I was making mention of, which again are distorted. You can think of them as kind of like distorted maps that are drawn over on both the precentral and the postcentral gyrus. And what they do is they give an appreciation for how much neuronal activity is devoted to a particular part of the body, right? And the distortion part comes from the fact that there are not as many. So you can see here, this one here in purple is the homunculus for the precentral gyrus. So this is going to be the motor, right? This is going to be the kind of the motor map. And you can see in this map that the hand is drawn disproportionately large compared to, if you look at disproportionately large compared to the chin, um, and the reason that the hand is drawn so large, and certainly actually a better comparison would be look at the size of the hand compared to the size of the foot, right? These are not proportionally drawn. And what this tells you is that there are many more neurons associated with controlling muscles of the hand than there are with controlling muscles of the foot. And I think it's worth mentioning that this homunculus is not necessarily a static drawing, right? We can change, we can kind of to some degree determine our own maps when it comes, especially to the proportions of the different parts of the body that are represented. So, you hear about, there was a documentary at one point in time that followed this woman who had a condition in which she was born with no arms. And so from the time she was born, she used her legs and her feet to substitute essentially for her arms and her hands. And she had incredible dexterity when it came to her fine motor control of her feet was as good as my fine motor control of my hands. And that is likely because she didn't have neurons that were devoted to this function. She was using this appendage in her foot to substitute for this function. And so all of that activity from a very, very early age, all of those synapses uh, kind of went to reinforce being able to give more fine motor control to her foot and to her leg. And so for her, this map would be drawn very differently. The arm would be, you know, so small as to be insignificant, and then it would be the leg that would take up a much larger space. It would be drawn proportionally speaking much different. Um, and then we have that same homunculus for the somatosensory cortex within the postcentral gyrus. And again, same concepts hold as far as the number of neurons that are devoted to providing sensation to a particular part of the body. So again, the hand and the foot are drawn out of proportion because we're able to discriminate a lot more using our hands than we are our feet because we have more receptors to do so and more synaptic activity devoted to picking up sensations in the hand. Um, you'll also notice a big difference between the somatosensory and the motor cortex is if you look at the lips, right? The lips are drawn much, much larger over here than they are in the motor cortex homunculus. And that's because we have a lot of sensations. We have a lot of receptors in our lips that bring information to our brain for processing. Um, I suppose I should be specific, the parietal lobes for processing. And we don't have that, we don't have, proportionally speaking, we do not have that same kind of fine motor control over our lips. So that's what the homunculi do is they kind of give us an idea of how much activity from a neuron standpoint is devoted to these different regions of our body. Okay, so looking in the frontal lobe, because again, that's where motor function is taken care of, right? I think I mentioned a lot of what's on this slide, but we'll go through it. So Broca's area right here is found in the left hemisphere. And it is an area that is, because it's found in the frontal lobe, that tells you it has something to do with motor function. And Broca's area is the area that is responsible for allowing you to form words. If Broca's area is damaged, but nothing else is damaged, the individual retains the ability to understand written and verbal language, but they lose the ability to be able to form the words required for verbal for verbalization. The frontal eye field, again, also found in the frontal lobe, and it regulates the movements that are required for reading. It also, the frontal eye field allows us to allows our eyes to track together. So if something, runs across your field of view, you're able to track it with both eyes as long as the frontal eye field is functioning correctly. And then for sensory areas, again, these areas are found in the parietal lobe. So we have the sensory areas. This has to do with sensation for, tactile. When we were talking about the somatosensory association, or I'm sorry, the somatosensory cortex and the postcentral gyrus, we're talking about tactile information that is coming in. So information about touch and pressure and tactile kind of info. And then, but aside from that type of information, we have, of course, lots of other types of sensory information. We have visual information that's sensory. We have sound information that is sensory, smell and taste. And all of those go to different areas within the brain, not the parietal lobes. And then, of course, we have association areas. And then in addition to the association areas for the lobes, should also say we also have these multimodal association areas. that compile and integrate information from the different lobes of the brain in order for us to make sense um, of those sensations that we are experiencing. So, primary visual cortex, that is the occipital lobe. So, the occipital lobe is where information that comes in, that's comes in ultimately from the retina, is taken to the occipital lobe and then associated, and then it's taken to the occipital lobe, and then that information is associated in the visual association area, which again, you can think of these association areas as kind of being memory storage facilities for these particular parts of the brain. What these association areas do is they integrate the new incoming information with past experiences that we have about similar types of information. Helps us to make sense of what it is that we're seeing. Um, Same thing with primary. So primary auditory context, also there is an association area within the temporal lobe, which is where auditory information is taken and processed. Olfactory, same with olfactory. Olfactory is an interesting, when we get to the thalamus, I'll say this again, but it's somewhat controversial. It used to be thought, and I suppose by most researchers, it's still by and large accepted that that smells are the only sensation that are not run through a filter. There's new, and that filter is the thalamus. There's new information that kind of suggests that it might not be that it's not run through a filter, it's just run through the thalamus in a different kind of way, for lack of a more articulate way to put that. Kind of more on that to come, but all the same, um, sensations of smell come into the temporal lobe, um, and when smells come into this is when, because the frontal lobe is your seat of consciousness. um Sorry, not your frontal lobe, your cerebral cortex is your seat of consciousness by and large. So when those smells come in and are processed by the olfactory center and by the association area, that information is then sent to these multimodal association areas, and you become aware of the smell. And then finally, your sense of taste, again, as I mentioned, is handled or processed by a region of, or a lobe, um, of the cerebrum that is deep to the other lobes that we were discussing, and it's called the insula. And so the insula is involved in processing taste, um, and also plays an important role in equilibrium. Also has taste and smell are also intimately related to one another. And so there are portions of your ability to smell um, that are also associated with the insula. So when somebody damages the insula, the main impairment of function that you see is that person losing their ability to taste. Okay, so this slide goes over those association areas that I've been alluding to. So again, what association areas do is there are areas where integration takes place. These are areas after the information is brought into a particular region. Um, for example, we use the example in this slide of the premotor cortex, right? So the premotor cortex, which is found right, hopefully you guys can see right here. Um, it is an association area, and it's the association area that takes new information coming in. So for example, if you want to play the piano, right? And you've played the piano for many years, you sit down in front of the piano, and your ability to actually move your fingers and press the keys, that's generated, of course, in the precentral gyrus. or those are the axons that fire off, along with axons in the premotor cortex. And so it's the premotor cortex that is going to kind of have the quote unquote memories of you playing the piano in the past. And so this area is going to essentially work with the neurons in the precentral gyrus in order for you to produce learned fluid movements, right? Um, and that's there, you can think of thousands of activities in which that's the case, in which if these association areas are damaged, um, people lose I guess you can think of it as akin to people lose the ability to have any kind of practiced or rehearsed movement. It's not to say that they can't produce motor. There's no motor output. It's just it's no longer, it no longer has context. And so any kind of learned movement oftentimes has to be relearned. And then for the somatosensory association area, the same thing kind of holds true, as far as the idea is that it's new information that's coming in this case, as opposed to going out. As it is going out, is associated with other neurons, other synapses that are found in the somatosensory association area. And those, just like what I was saying with the prefrontal, with the premotor cortex, these are areas that they're basically where memories are stored. And so for the somatosensory association area, this is what would allow you, or the kind of the prototypical example that's given is if you go to, a party and someone has you reach into a bag and and there's 3 objects, and with your eyes closed, you have to identify those 3 objects. You reach into the bag and you feel around and you feel something that is metal. It's got kind of like a jagged edges on it. It's attached to something that jangles. You use all of that information. So the information that's being taken to the postcentral gyrus is going to be the information that tactile information that you're getting from the object you're touching, but you're associating that new information with your past experiences of information or of senses that have those same qualities and that you've discovered what those are. And you can, with your eyes closed, go, oh, that feels a lot like a key on a keychain, right? And then what do you know? It's a key on a keychain. So if you damage your somatosensory association area, what happens is you lose the ability, just like what we were talking about with the premotor cortex, you lose the ability to put things in context. And so you lose the ability to integrate that new, in this case, information coming in with other experiences you've had about similar types of sensations.
Corey, are the association areas always coordinated with a motor or sensory region, or are they ever on their own?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they are never on their own. You mean, like, do they just stand alone and then incorporate information from all of the different areas of the
Yeah, like
brain?
are they standalone, like of their own function and of their own, like I guess, reason for existing? I'm having a
Sure.
hard time.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're touching on is we do have these multimodal association areas, which are basically association areas for association areas. So we have these regions of the brain that take all of the associative data, and then they integrate that to, and then that information, and that takes place in the frontal lobe, and allows for us to make kind of complex conclusions based on a variety of different information coming in at us. So yes, in that sense, we sure do. For every lobe that we have an association area. So there's an association area for the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe. But then, yes, yeah, absolutely, we do. In addition to those, we have these multimodal association areas.
Okay, and can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, um, it seems, at least from what maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, but it seems like we've got a motor area that has a corresponding sensory area, and both of those areas have association areas that are also corresponding. Is that fair to say or correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's fair to say. So we have these. So think of, yes, it's absolutely fair to say. What I would say is think of the frontal lobe, and we're not talking about the prefrontal cortex, but I'm talking about the motor cortex portions of the frontal lobe, which are kind of the more, as you can see in this picture, posteriorly located, right? These regions of the frontal lobe are devoted to motor output, so to producing movement, right? And the one that the association area is this larger area, kind of right in the front, that produces movement based on movement that you want to do, and then associated or integrated with similar movements that you've done in the past in order to produce fluid movement, right? And so that's what this is. And then we have a corresponding region, just like you said, for the parietal lobe, in which we have this strip of tissue, and we always call these the gyri, right? So this is the one in the motor cortex is the pre-central gyrus, and this is the post-central gyrus in the parietal lobe. So these are kind of the strips of um, tissue, if you will, that are actually firing off to produce the simple movement and or pick up on the sensory information you're acutely being exposed to or acutely wanting to perform. And then these regions, these association regions, are integrating the either the output or the input with past experiences of similar activities in order to produced, I guess I hesitate to say learned response, but I would say integrated type of response, right? So did that answer your question? So yes, these are the association areas that are associated with either the precentral gyrus, which is in the motor cortex, or the postcentral gyrus, which is in the somatosensory. So this is picking up on movements that are, this has to do with movement, and this has to do with interpretation of senses.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll expand on these concepts as we go through. Um, and this kind of touches on what we were just talking about. So again, these association areas that we find that are associated with each lobe, what they do is they take the either, if we're talking about, in this case we are, because these visual association areas and auditory association areas, these are going to be taking in um, the information, the auditory or the visual information coming in, and then it's going to integrate that information with past experiences on similar information that's come in order to help us make sense of what we are seeing, right? In order to help us make sense of the visual of the visual sensory information we're getting. And so if these association areas are damaged, we kind of lose context, right? So we might not, yeah, we lose context. We still retain the ability to see, but we might not see, for example, our street on the house we live in and go, oh, there's my street, I must live over there, um, or we'll hear a voice calling our name, and it's our mother's voice, but we don't make that association of, oh, that's my mom calling me. um so that's kind of the I guess importance or the significance of the association areas. They're really memory areas in many ways, uh, places where specific information that is either visual or auditory. Visual, in the case, it would be stored in the occipital lobe. Auditory, it would be stored in the temporal lobe. But they're kind of memory storage areas, memories of past experiences with that particular type of data. And then we have these functional brain regions. And when I was saying the multimodal brain association areas, this is what I was referring to. So these multimodal, you can or multi-association areas play an absolutely essential role in integrating information and helping us make sense of that information in a higher ordered uh, thought processing kind of way, right? So, so again, Wernicke's area, which I was talking about a moment ago, found in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's is the part of the brain that's responsible for recognizing and comprehending both spoken and written language, right? And it works along with Broca's area to allow us to both understand what's being said or is written to us on a piece of paper, and then to communicate back either in written word or verbally. And if you damage one, if you damage both of those areas, you lose the ability to communicate in that way. But if you damage Wernicke's, for example, but Broca's is left untouched, these people will often talk in what is called word salad. So they will just they have no problem they have the words, they can produce the words, but the words lose their meaning. They also can still write, they still retain their memories of how to make words, but the words themselves lose meaning. And then the opposite is true if you damage Broca's, but Wernicke's is left intact. These individuals retain the ability, words have meaning the way they always do for us. It's just the ability to express those words is lost. And that is for both written and verbal. And then the Gnostic area is made up of regions of the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes. And the Gnostic area plays an important role in integrating information that from the information from the association areas from each of these lobes. And it provides us with a comprehensive understanding. So, for example, your alarm goes off, you open your eyes, it's dark outside, and you smell coffee. The Gnostic area, based on all of that information coming in, the first thought that might come into your head is, ooh, I woke up, it's really early, that's why it's still dark out, but I'm supposed to get up, that's why my alarm went off, and it's got to be morning, not night, because I smoked coffee. So those are just some kind of relevant areas of the brain. And then I end this particular presentation with the case of Phineas Gage, and that's so Phineas Gage he's an interesting case. This is an event. He lived in the I don't know when he was born, but he was an adult in 1848, whatever that means. I imagine he was at least 18 in 1848, and he worked on a railroad. And he was always well known as being this very responsible, kind of wise beyond his years, honest, just he wasn't a wild child, so to speak. Not at all impulsive, very predictable, not flaky, et cetera, et cetera. So he had this accident, and in this accident, a rod shot, and it went through punctured basically below his left eye, and they've mapped it out so that you can kind of see. I think this is the best way to see it. It went below the orbit of his left eye, and then it missed, which is kind of amazing. It missed his carotid artery, and it went up and it punctured up through the frontal lobe of his brain. and he lived after they were able to remove the rod, and he lived. Um, but after he lived, it was noticed he was basically his personality had completely changed. He was impulsive. He was kind of a jerk. Became known as a liar and a thief, and people couldn't depend on him. And anyway, the reason I highlight this case is this is one of the first cases in which researchers started to make a connection between personality and impulse control and critical thinking being those activities or those functions being determined by the frontal lobe of the brain. Okay, so hold on one moment. So why don't we start in, at least for the next 15 minutes, on the second part of the brain. Hold on. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to move in and we're going to start talking about some of the just different structures that we find in the brain and the functions they are responsible for. So, central white matter. Central white matter, we know because we've talked about it, is white, or white matter is white because of myelination, right? When we talk about groups of axons within the central nervous system, we call those tracks. So we have three main types of tracks that I want you to be familiar with. The first of these are what we call association tracks. So what characterizes an association tract is that it is a tract within the same hemisphere. So it connects different parts of the brain within the same hemisphere. We have what are called short tracks and long tracks. The other name given to those are fasciculi. So short and long fasciculi just have to do with, are we connecting portions within the same hemisphere of a brain that are close to one another? That would be a short tract. If they're far from one another, it's a long tract. Then we have what are called commissural. So commissural tracts are tracts that connect the two hemispheres. There are not many of them. The main type of commissural tract that we have is what we call the corpus callosum, right? The corpus callosum is this, I'll show you here, this upper lip, if you will. What you're seeing here is that this space is the lateral ventricle in this hemisphere, and on top, this is the corpus callosum. And then for what it's worth, this bottom portion is what we call the fornix. So the corpus callosum is a tract that allows for communication between the two hemispheres. I think I mentioned last time we talked that this is for if individuals have uncontrolled epilepsy. Oftentimes this tract is severed in order to help control if there's no other way essentially to control the seizures. That is one way to help make it so that the seizures don't spread from one hemisphere to the other. And then finally, we have what are called projection tracts. And these are tracts that link the cerebral cortex down to lower parts of the brain, such as the brain stem and the spinal cord. An important function. So, and I like this picture here because you can see here are those projection tracks, right? They're coming down. And then you can see right here this phenomenon that we call decussation of the pyramids. So decussation means to cross over, right? And we already talked about this phenomenon in the context. I think we were talking about the optic nerves, but we were talking about how cranial nerves, the nerves that control the right side of the body, those nerves originate on the left from the left side of the brain, right? And that's for those cranial nerves. And then for these nerves down here, this is where that crossing over takes place. So here's, and again, decusation just means to cross, to encounter and cross. So that's what this decusation takes place in the medulla oblongata when it comes to those tracks. Okay, so this concept of lateralization. Okay, so we talked last time about how the cerebral cortex is broken, or the cerebrum is broken into, or divided into, made up of two hemispheres. And those two hemispheres are, for the most part, mirror images of one another, right? However, um, lateralization, lateralization is the word that we use to describe the fact that even though they are mirror images of one another, they are not exactly the same, right? There are differences functionally, and there are also anatomical asymmetries that exist, right? So, for example, we have what are called patalius. So, a patalius is the phenomenon by which a portion of either the frontal or the back part of the hemisphere does not line up with the frontal or the back portion of the other hemisphere. So, for example, when people are, and this is not a hard and fast rule, as we'll see here in a moment, but by and large, if someone is right-handed, those individuals have both a right frontal and a left occipital patalius, which means that the uh, their right hemisphere, the frontal portion of the right hemisphere, is, it's almost like having like ever so slightly crooked teeth, right? This hemisphere is set forward a bit farther in front than the left frontal hemisphere. And then in the back, um, there's a left occipital patalius that can also occur. And again, that would just mean the same thing as the right frontal patalius, which is a patalius is just when it's goes out a bit further, than it doesn't line up perfectly. Okay, so kind of building on this idea of lateralization, when it comes to functional differences, and a lot of people have heard, this will probably sound somewhat familiar to everybody because they kind of talk about these concepts a lot in magazines and what have you, when it comes to, oh, are you, take this test, are you left brained or right brained? And there's something to that, but this is what they're touching on. So the left the left hemisphere, right, is what we call the categorical hemisphere. um, and the reason it's called the categorical hemisphere is because largely the way in which uh, memories and activities are stored in this area. So in the left hemisphere, we have our areas. First of all, the left side of the left hemisphere is the hemisphere that is responsible for speech, right? Left hemisphere is where you find Wernicke's area. It's where you find Broca's area. Um, the other thing that is associated with the left hemisphere is when it comes to, I guess, processing, um, and this is kind of tied to language, processing packets of information. Um, the way that that part of the brain tends to process information is by categorizing it. And so people who are quote unquote left brained um, are typically these, this is our centers of math, being able to do mathematical functioning. Like if I were to give you, hook your brain up to electrodes or give you, um, you know, an MRI while having you try and solve, look at images of solving math problems or something along these lines. That it would be the left side of your brain that would highlight, that would light up the most, I should say. And that's because for most of us, that's where there's tissue devoted on that side of the brain to helping with those functions. Um, the right side of the brain is what we call the representational hemisphere. So, this is the hemisphere that is often associated as being the seat of your imagination. Musical ability is found in the right hemisphere. What other things? Shape, being able to, I guess, being comfortable with three-dimensional kind of navigation. So this is what I'm going for. Navigate, like if you're really good at reading a map or navigating an unknown city, um, people like that tend to be right-brained. So this ability to kind of, yeah, recognize your surroundings, I suppose, um, and three-dimensionally be able to navigate within those surroundings, that is considered primarily a right brain function. Um, I'll tell you right now that there's again, there rarely are there hard and fast rules. So when it comes to those functions, it's the coordination between the left and the right brain that is so incredibly important. And also, if there are situations, let's say an individual is born with only one hemisphere, or damage occurs early on in life to one hemisphere, the other hemisphere is able to take up the functions. So the right hemisphere can take on if what I'm trying to say is if your left hemisphere is damaged, that does not mean that you can no longer do math. Um, it might mean that you have to relearn some of those concepts, but new synaptic activity can be formed and compensated for by the other hemisphere. Um, the other thing I want to say in this is that when it comes to this right brain or right hemisphere being the representational hemisphere and left being the categorical, that is true for most people because most people are right-handed. Um, Left-handed people have this whole special thing going on. So left-handed people are just a bit more versatile when it comes to either side of their brain being able to take. So for left-handed people, their left hemisphere might be acting as the representational hemisphere, and their right hemisphere might be acting as the categorical hemisphere. Um, so yeah, it's just like I said, I think I have another slide for left-handed people here in just a moment. But and then again, the hemispheres are in constant contact with with one another through the corpus callosum, right? That commissural tract. Okay. So when it comes to this lateralization, this specialization that occurs by which the left hemisphere becomes categorical and right becomes representational, that happens early on in life. So before we get to kind of kindergarten age. Um, in addition to those functional differences, some other physical differences that exist, so some other types of lateralization that exist, um, are that women tend to have a thicker posterior corpus callosum. Um, Adults have much more lateralization than children do. And then, as I mentioned, when it comes to right and left-handedness, um, left-handed people can have either of the hemispheres be their categorical hemisphere. So for left-handed people, the right hemisphere can be the categorical, and the left can be the representational. But for people who are right-handed, this is pretty much holds true. For people who are ambidextrous, because I always get that question, I don't really know. I don't know. I've not seen enough research. My guess, I would intuitively guess that people who are ambidextrous, it's just kind of a coin toss. Okay, so I'll stop there, you guys. since we're giving the exam next week, and I will post an announcement about that, I don't feel nearly as rushed on time. On Wednesday, we will definitely finish this, and we will probably have time to